Okay. Good evening. Firstly, I would like to thank Professor Stirati for an extremely clear presentation and Alexander for inviting me in this interesting lessons and interview with economists. In this presentation, I will present an overview of the studies on labor in ancient Near East, and after the typologies of workers, of course, in ancient Mesopotamia. And finally, I just present some paragraphs of Code of Hammurabi, in which we can see the different wages of all different kind of workers. I will read, because I can be find to be not too long. Work in ancient Mesopotamia was central to the function of society, influencing the economy, social and political structures. The region saw the rise of complex systems of labor that supported various sectors, from agriculture to craftsmanship, trade, and state projects. The organization of labor was highly structured, often based on social hierarchies and economic needs. The study of labor in ancient Mesopotamia has evolved over the years. Early studies of labor in the ancient Near East focused on economic and administrative aspects, but in recent decades, the field has broadened to include social, cultural, and political dimensions. This evolution reflects the changing priorities of scholarship and growing recognition of labor as a key factor in understanding the history of the region. The earliest scholarly studies of labor in ancient Near East were rooted in the disciplines of economics and history. In the late 19th and early 20th century, scholars focused primarily on deciphering ancient texts, primarily cuneiform tablets, that contained records of economic transactions, labor regulations, and administrative decrees. The most famous of these texts was the Code of Hammurabi, more or less 54 BC, which contained laws regarding the treatment of workers, slaves, and laborers. Scholars in this period were primarily interested in understanding the practical aspect of labor, such as wages, working conditions, and labor law. Scholars in the early 20th century, including those from the field of archaeology and archaeology, focused on discovering and translating ancient texts that offered information about the division of labor, the role of workers in a large state project, such as construction of temples and palaces and slavery. These studies laid the groundwork for understanding how labor was organized in early Mesopotamian society, as well as the economy structure that supported it. By the mid-20th century, the field of labor studies in the ancient Near East began to evolve with the growing influence of social history. Scholars like George Roos and others began to move behind economic concern to explore how labor was shaped by social structures, class division, and gender roles. The importance of understanding labor in the context of power relation became increasingly apparent. Scholars began to examine not only how labor was divided, but also how it was organized and controlled by political elites and religious institutions. The study of labor during this period also began to incorporate anthropological and sociological approaches. These methods allowed scholars to better understand the relationship between different types of labor, such as agricultural, craft, and slave labor. and the ways in which these workers were positioned within the broader social and political hierarchies of the time. In the same vein, the rise of Marxist-inspired approaches to history in the 16th and 17th also impacted the study of labor in the ancient world. Scholars like Michael Hudson implied Marxist theory to ancient economies, interpreting the role of labor within the context of class struggle, exploration, and development of early capitalism. This perspective highlighted the ways in which state-sponsored projects, such as large-scale infrastructure and monumental architecture, were often driven by the exploitation of laborers, peasants, and slaves. In the 1917 and 1918s, the study of ancient economies, social structure, and labor conditions began to gain more attention in the field of archaeological and history. This reflected a growing interest in understanding the lives and ordinary people in ancient societies, rather than focusing solely on kings, elites, and monumental achievements. The treatment of workers in ancient Mesopotamia likely influenced the broader academic environment, fostering a holistic approach to understanding the civilization's structure, including languages and social conditions. The condition of low-ranking workers in ancient Mesopotamia were a crucial part in the so-called Gelb-Diakonov controversy. The controversies between Gelb and Diakonov refers to a scholarly debate in the field of ancient Greece studies, particularly concerning the interpretation of the social and economic structures in ancient Mesopotamia. Those were years of strong debates on the translations of certain words used to qualify labor categories and on the definition of slavery. The two scholars, Gelb, an US sociologist, and Diakonov, a Soviet historians, held different views on key aspects on the Mesopotamian society, especially related to the role of the labor economy and the nature of the state. Gelb argued for a more traditional hierarchical interpretation of ancient Mesopotamian society. His work often focused on the role of centralized institutions, such as temples and palaces, in organizing and controlling labor. He suggested that in Mesopotamian, labor was highly organized and controlled by these institutions, and that much the workforce, both skilled and unskilled, was employed by the state or religious authorities. Gelb also emphasizes the importance of socioeconomic class divisions in the ancient world, with elites holding power and controlling land and resources. He viewed the economy as being largely driven by state-sponsored projects, such as construction of monumental architecture, for example, ziggurats and palaces, and he believed that these projects required a well-organized and disciplined labor force, which included both free and enslaved workers. Diakonov disagreed with Gelb's interpretation of Mesopotamian society. Diakonov argued that Gelb's analysis was too focused on the centralized top-down control of labor and did not adequately account for the economic and social diversity present in ancient Mesopotamian society. He believed that Gelb's view overlooked the more decentralized aspect of the economy, including the role of private landlords, merchants, and small-scale producers. Diakonov also took issue with Gelb's emphasis on the dominance of state and religious institutions in organizing labor. He argued that while these institutions played an important role, there was also a significant presence of private entrepreneurs and a more fluid relationship between state control and private economic activities. Diakonov's work emphasizes the economic autonomy of smaller actors within the system and challenged the view that the economy was primarily state-driven. Diakonov was the principal author of several books devoted to ancient Near East, which led to a better knowledge of history, economy, and culture of this region, and which helped to understand social psychological factors and the evolution of the early civilization. The core of the controversy revolved around the degree to which ancient Mesopotamian labor and economic were controlled by the state and religious institutions versus the influence of private entrepreneurs, local autonomy, and market dynamics. This debate was significant because it influenced how historians and archaeologists interpreted the economic and social structure of Mesopotamia. Gel's model suggested a more rigid and controlled systems of labor, whereas Diakonov's alternative view pointed to a more dynamic and less centralized economic environment. Over time, Diakonov's perspective gained more traction and scholarship on ancient Mesopotamia became more nuanced and interdisciplinary, while Gelb's view still holds a weight in some areas, particularly regarding the central role of religious and state institutions in organizing large social projects. Many scholars now recognize the ancient Mesopotamian society was more heterogeneous than Gelb's model suggests. The debate between these two scholars highlighted the complexity and interpreting the ancient economies and remain an important moment in history of ancient Mesopotamian studies. In summary, the Gelb-Diakonov controversy encapsulated a broader academic discussion about the balance between state control and private initiative in ancient Mesopotamian labor and economy. This controversy was part of the broad academic context in which this debate took place, especially as scholars sought to understand the full picture of Mesopotamian society, the study of language, legal system, and economic records, necessarily intervening with discussion of social hierarchies, including the status of workers. Late 20th century and early 21st century studies in recent decades, the study of labor in ancient Near East has become more interdisciplinary, drawing on insight from archaeology, anthropology, gender studies, and cultural history. Scholars have increasingly sought to understand labor as a social and cultural practice that was integral to shaping ancient identities and communities. One key development has been the increasing interest in gender and roles of women in labor. Early studies often overlooked the contribution of women to the economy, particularly in domestic works, textile production, and religious service. Feminist scholars, beginning in the 1980s, sought to recover the experience of women in ancient societies by examining both written and material evidence. Their work illuminated the ways in which women's labor was crucial to the functioning of households, market, and temples. Additionally, there has been a growing recognition of need for comparative studies between different regions of the ancient Near East, as well as with other ancient civilizations such as Egypt, Greece, and Rome. This has allowed scholars to better understand the unique features of labor systems in places like Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Levant, while also recognizing broader regional and global patterns. In the 21st century, new technologies and digital tools have opened new possibilities for the study of labor in ancient Near East. Archaeologists and historians are increasingly turning to geographical information systems and other digital tools to map ancient labor practices and reconstruct the geographic area of world of working ancient cities and landscapes. Digital databases of cuneiform texts, legal codes, and administrative records are now accessible to scholars worldwide, allowing for more comprehensive analysis of comparative research. One promising development in recent years is the growing use of bioarchaeology to study labor in the ancient Near East. By examining scattered remains, scholars can gain insight into the physical demands placed on workers in ancient societies. This approach has revealed important information about the health and well-being of laborers, as well as the types of work they performed. For example, studies of skeletal deformities and wear patterns on bones have helped reconstruct the daily lives of agricultural workers, builders, and slaves. The study of labor in ancient Near East is a multifaceted field. In fact, it came a long way from its early focus on economic transaction and legal codes. Today, scholars approach this subject from a variety of angles, considering not only the practical and economic aspect of labor, but also its social, cultural, and political dimension. With advances in technology, interdisciplinary approaches and growing interest in marginalized group, the field is becoming more nuanced and sophisticated. The labor of the workers in ancient Near East, whether slaves, peasants, or skilled artisans, was essential to the development of regions' civilizations. By continuing to study the complexity of these labor systems, scholars deepen our understanding of how ancient societies functioned and how labor contributed to the shaping of their history. But now, let's turn to a more detailed analysis of the organization of labor in ancient Near East. In ancient Mesopotamia, workers played a central role in the functions of society, which was based on agriculture, trade, and the building of large infrastructure. The conditions of workers varied depending on their social class, profession, and the period of Mesopotamian history, but generally, there were clear distinctions between the elite, middle, and lower classes. Here some key aspects of the condition for different workers in Mesopotamia. Agricultural workers, most of the population in ancient Mesopotamia worked in agriculture. These workers often worked on land owned by the temple, the king, or wealthy landowners. They grew staple crops like barley, wheat, and vegetables, and raising livestock. The work was physically demanding and depended on the seasons. They worked long hours in hot, difficult conditions, especially during the harvest. Despite their importance to society, agricultural workers were at the bottom of the social hierarchy and often lived in poverty. They might not have had their own land and were subject to the demand of their landowner, the temples, or the state. Harvest times was centrally a crucial part of the Mesopotamian agricultural year, with regard both to the economic implications and the organization of work and workers. Many laborers had to be hired in order to meet the exceptional needs amount of work requires. Harvesters could be hired either on a daily basis or for the entire harvest time, either one by one or in groups. Our understanding of Mesopotamian economy and social dynamics, and especially of agricultural works organization in Mesopotamia, is mostly based on an imposing amount of original administrative documentation. The administrative texts usually considered belong to different typologies: contract, list, receipt. Many of these administrative documents dealing with the harvesters include the contract for the hiring of harvest laborers, contract for the loan of a specific number of harvesters, list of numbers and list of workers followed by personal names, list of barley quantities for harvesters, record of quantities of silver for harvesting, text that record the depths of harvesters. The assignment
Professor Rositani, can you please speak closer to the mic?
Sì.
Microphone.
Sì. Sorry. All the harvest contracts have a similar structure. Each contract registers that one or more people, in some texts we have also 3 or 4 people, received silver or a barley allocation from another person, the conveyor, for the harvesting or for the harvesters. The contract continues prescribing the duty of the beneficiaries. At harvest time, he should bring the harvesters, or if he does not do it, he will be labeled according to the decree of the king, following the witness, the date, and 1 or more seals. In some contracts, especially those dating back to Hammurabi's reign, some additional information is found, such as how many workers were hired or for how many days they are hired. Occasionally, in some texts, the barley supplies to feed the workers are also features. The person who assigned barley or silver may be the landowners, but it's often an intermediary person tasked with managing the land, owned by large landowners, such as high-ranking administrative officials, priestesses, military officers. In some cases, the land is owned by the temples or by the palace. Skilled craftsmen, skilled artisans such as metal workers, potters, weavers, and builders were often in higher demand. They played a key role in producing goods, but they marked the temples and the royal courts. These workers could be organized in guilds and workshops. The weaving workshop can be public, managed by the temples or by the palace, or private, run by wealthy owners. Often in public workshop, family world captives and their children are employed as workers. In other activities such as building construction or canal digging, large numbers of their laborers were also employed. Public works back then could serve as a means to support the more vulnerable segment of society. Prisoners and slaves could also be used in public works. Workers' guilds are attached in ancient Mesopotamian both to text and archaeological evidence. In fact, in some cities, we have some district in which we have found multiple workshops operated together, such as those for pottery production, leather working, folding workshops. Administrative texts, include the Code of Hammurabi, also attest to association of works, such as merchant or goldsmiths, who formed societies to pooling their economic resources and dividing the profit proportionally to their personal investment. Skilled craftsmen generally had better conditions than agricultural workers. They lived in urban areas where they were able to sell their goods and sometimes enjoyed a higher status social status. However, they were still under the control of temple or state authorities, and their work was often closely tied to religious and political structures. As seen before, many craftsmen worked in large state-sponsored projects, such as the construction of palaces or temples. The Code of Hammurabi also provides specific information about the wages of different kind of workers, especially farmers, day laborers, and artisans. It's specific compensation for workers who were injured while working, and established rules for dealing with dispute between workers and employers. But we'll see this later. Slave labor. Slavery existed in ancient Mesopotamia, and slaves were used for domestic service, agricultural labor, and large-scale construction projects. Slaves could be of three types: slaves born in-house, slaves acquired through fights in areas that were politically and economically weaker, such as the mountain in the east region, or in the steppe in the west region, or prisoners of war. Not all prisoners of war became slaves, but when they did, such as the Arabs defeated by the Assyrians in very large numbers, they entered the long-distance slave trade like any other slaves. The situation was different for insolvent debtors, free people who, rather than becoming serfs, were required to work as servants for the creditor for a set period of time, 3 or 5 years. Slaves had worse condition in ancient Mesopotamia. They worked in difficult and dangerous environment, especially in construction or labor-intensive tasks. Slaves could be bought, sold, and traded, and their lives were under the control of their masters. In the Code of Hammurabi, slaves are considered the most vulnerable segment of the population, but they are generally traded in a relatively human manner. They can also be freed by their masters or gain their freedom if they manage to acquire enough silver to do so. Builders and laborers for large projects. Mesopotamian cities required large infrastructure projects such as ziggurat, palaces, irrigation system, and defensive walls. This project required a massive workforce, often consisting of both free laborers and slaves. While some of these workers might have been skilled laborers, many were unskilled and worked on large government-organized projects. The condition could be harsh, especially when working on monumental construction in the hot Mesopotamian climate. They worked under the supervision of foremen or overseers, and were sometimes compensated with food, oil, or other basic necessities. They were support of forced labor or corvée labor, where people were compelled to work for the state as part of their duty to the king. The temple of Mesopotamia were measured center of power, wealth, and administration. Temple workers, including priests and priestesses and servants, were important members of society. Priests and priestesses held significant influence. Workers in temples had a relatively stable existence, as they were often supported by temples' wealth, which came from offering and agricultural production. While priests lived with more privileges, temple servants and laborers did manual work, such as maintaining the temple ground or offering sacrifice. Their work had both religious and social importance, which might have provided them with some status in society. Women in ancient Mesopotamia had various roles. Some worked in household as domestic servants, while others were employed as textile workers, weavers, and involved in other crafts. Women could also work as midwives, healers, or in religious roles, especially as priestesses. Recent studies have attempted to reconstruct the family ties of workers, especially low-level workers. In fact, women are typically registered in cuneiform text with their young children, while there are no references to husband or adult children. The working conditions for women were generally difficult, as they were often expected to manage both domestic chores and their professional responsibilities. Women in the lower classes had more labor-intensive tasks, while those in the upper classes might have the more comfortable lives. However, they had limited political and social power, and their rights were often governed by the laws and of their male relatives or husband. The condition of women was significantly better in Babylon under the reign of Hammurabi. In his code, in fact, many laws are aimed at protecting women, particularly widows and orphans. Legal protection and right. Ancient Mesopotamian laws, like those found in the Code of Hammurabi, included regulation for workers. They were laws related to the treatment of workers, wages, and right of slaves. For example, workers were often compensated in food, especially barley, or in silver, but their rights were generally subordinated to the interest of the landowners or the state or the temple. Some workers, like temple laborers, had more security, while other, particularly slaves and agricultural workers, had minimal legal protection. The laws also set standards for the wages in some trade. Okay. In the Code of Hammurabi, we can find some indication for wages. Of course, it's just a suggestion, but it's quite normal. It was possible to do a comparison with the contract, and I have the possibility to see that there is a connection between the wages in the paragraph of the code and in the wages we find in the contract, in the everyday daily contract. For example, in the paragraph 2057, it's a man as an agricultural laborers, he shall give him 8 gur of barley per year. 8 gur means 2,500 liters of barley. If a man is an ox driver, he shall give him 6 gur of barley per year, so 1,800 liters. If a man, this is the paragraphs 242 and 43, if a man rent it an ox for 1 year, he shall give to its owner 4 gur of barley as the hire of an ox for the rear of the team, and 3 gur of barley as the hire of an ox for the middle of the team. And the other 2061, we can see if a man hires a herdsman to herd the cattle of the sheep and goat, he shall give him 8 gur of barley per year. And after, if a man hires a labor, agrum, lukunga, just a daily hired labor, he shall give 6 barley corn of silver per day from the beginning of the year until the end of the fifth month, and 5 barley corn of silver per day from the 6th month until the end of year. And more interesting is the last paragraph in 2074. If a man intended to hire a craftsman, he shall give per day, and we have a different kind of craftsmen. This paragraph is broken in some part, but we can see that there is different ways for textile workers, linen worker, stone cutter, bow maker, smith, carpenter, leather worker, reed worker, and builder. Where it's possible to reconstruct the wages, it's possible to see that there is a correspondence with the wage we know for this kind of workers in the contract, in the list, in the economic text. And another problem is the aspect of the responsibilities. Compensation is possible to have a responsibility for the laborers. For example, in another law, the laws of Eshnun, more or less contemporary to the Code of Hammurabi, in the paragraph 9, we see that should a man give 1 sickle of silver, more or less 1 sickle is half a kilo of silver for harvesting to or for an hired man, if he, the worker, was not ready for him and did not at all harvest for him, the harvesting he shall weigh out 10 sickles of silver. So you have to return 10 times the part, the sickles he received. In the Code of Hammurabi, we see also other cases of responsibilities. For example, if a shepherd to whom cattle or sheep and goats were given to shepherding is in receipt of his complete hire to his satisfaction, then allows the number of cattle to decrease, or the number of sheep and goats to decrease, or the number of offspring to diminish. He shall give for the loss of offspring and byproduct in accordance with the term of contract. And again, if a shepherd to whom cattle or sheep or goats were given for shepherding acts criminally and alter the brand of and sell them, they shall charge and convict him, and he shall replace for their owner cattle and sheep and goats tenfold that which he stole. And again, another paragraph, if in the enclosure an epidemic should break out or a lion make a kill, the shepherd shall clear himself before the god, and the owner of the enclosure shall accept responsibility for him for the loss sustained in the enclosure. Indeed, if he is negligent and allows means to spread the enclosure, the shepherd shall make restitutions in cattle, sheep, and goat for the damages caused by the mange, which allowed to spread in the enclosure and give it for to their owner. So we can see, of course, a different treatment if he is negligent, if he is a lie, or if he is just he just suggests there is an epidemic or a problem, but he is not responsible for this. In conclusion, we can see that the condition of workers in ancient Mesopotamia were heavily dependent of their status in society, while skilled laborers and temple workers may have had somewhat better living conditions, facing slaves and laborers on large state projects faced harsh and demanding work. The social structure was rigid, and much of the labor force had little power and freedom. The economic structure of ancient Mesopotamian, especially concerning low-ranking workers such as laborers, slaves, and craftsmen, was essentially for understanding the administrative and social systems in place. These workers were crucial to the functioning of the state, especially in major urban centers like Ur or Babylon or other cities. Discussion about these workers, their roles, and their treatment could influence the broader interpretation of Mesopotamian society. In Mesopotamian texts, record of workers' conditions, such as their wages, work schedules, and duties, were often detailed in the cuneiform tablet. This tablet are an essential part of the evidence that scholars, especially archaeologists and historians, study to reconstruct the history and functioning of the society, which involved understanding the roles of various classes, including workers. I just put also some bibliography indication. For example, we can see some important study of Gelb, approaches to the study of the ancient society. We saw the controversy between Gelb and Diakonov, and some other studies of Diakonov. For example, many are in Russian, but it's very interesting. The study that he is the editor of interesting study ancient Mesopotamian socioeconomic history, a collection of studies by Soviet scholars, and after also another interesting study is the social stratification of ancient society, and also main features of the economy and the monarchies of ancient Western Asia. About the slaves and the slavery, Diakonov and Gelb did some interesting studies. Gelb, the status of Gelb is very important. It's the Arua institution. Arua is the Sumerian word for slave, and also the other study of Gelb is very interesting. Prisoners for in early Mesopotamia is very old, but again, now we study this paper because it is really important. And Diagonov also studied some the slavery, especially in slaves, helos, and serfs in early Mesopotamian. We can find a summary of Gelb Diakonov controversy in recent study of Manuel Molina in the Real Lexicon of the Axiology. It's just a short study, but it's very, very interesting. Other studies about the bibliography, about the labor, the power, labor in ancient Near East, in American Oriental society. In this study, this volume, we can see especially the contribution of Steinkeller about the Ultra period. This is the last century of the first millennium BC. And he studied the labor and labor in ancient Near East in this period. It is very interesting. And also the contribution of Wetzel, compensation and craft workers and officially in Ur third period. So and this also in the last, these studies is about the last century, the last, from the 2000 from the last centuries of the third millennium. We can also remember the studies, the volume of Steinkeller and Hudson, labor in ancient world, especially the chapter of Steinkeller about the early Mesopotamian perspective, about the labor, and also the recent work of Amanda Podani, Weir's Scribe and Kings. It's a very interesting studies about the new history, a new point of view about the ancient Near East, and especially the work. For the slavery, I can suggest to read the very recent but well-written study of Seth Richardson, Mesopotamian slavery, in the volume Purged Handbook of Global Slavery. Is a summary of the slavery in ancient Mesopotamia, slavery that is prisoners of war, but more also the only prisoners of war. This is enough for me. Thank you for your attention.